There is a specific kind of quiet that happens after the door closes. Your children have visited. The house was loud for a few hours. Dishes clinking, grandchildren laughing, someone's phone buzzing on the counter. And then the car pulls out of the driveway and you stand in the entryway and you feel it arrive. Not sadness exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that settles into the chairs and the hallway and the space where a voice used to be. You go to say something out loud, out of habit, and there's no one to say it to. Maybe that's not your exact moment. Maybe yours is different. An empty side of the bed, a phone that used to ring more, a Tuesday afternoon with nowhere in particular to be and no one in particular to tell about it. But if you know that quiet, you know it doesn't announce itself as loneliness. It just feels like the room is a little too big for you now. Today we're going to talk about that quiet. Honestly, without pretending it isn't there, and without wrapping it in false cheer. Here's what this isn't. This isn't a video that tells you to just get a hobby, join a club, and everything will fix itself. You've heard that advice. Maybe you've even tried it, and it helped a little, and then the quiet came back anyway because loneliness isn't actually a scheduling problem. What we're going to explore instead are 9 honest truths about loneliness in these years. Truths that wise elders come to, sometimes slowly, sometimes through hard seasons. Truths that don't erase the ache, but change your relationship to it. Because there's a difference between fighting loneliness your whole life and finally learning to sit with it, without it owning you. Stay with me. This is for the part of you that's been quiet about this for a long time. Let's start with the thing most people get wrong first. Reason number 1. Loneliness isn't weakness. It's a signal, not a flaw. Have you ever caught yourself apologizing, even just in your own head, for feeling lonely? As if wanting company at 74 means something went wrong with you, some test of independence you failed? A lot of people carry that shame quietly, especially your generation, raised on the idea that needing others was something you were supposed to grow out of, not into. But here's what that shame gets backwards. Loneliness isn't a personality problem. It's a biological one, and it has been since long before either of us was born. Human beings survived because we stayed close to each other, in groups, in families, in villages where being cut off from the tribe was, quite literally, dangerous. Your body still carries that ancient wiring. When you feel isolated, some old, deep part of your nervous system reads it as a kind of threat, the same way hunger tells you that you need food, or thirst tells you that you need water. Loneliness is your mind's way of saying, you were built for connection, and right now you don't have enough of it. That's not a character defect. That's your design working exactly as intended. What makes this harder for people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s is that so many of you were taught the opposite lesson. You were told that strength meant not needing anyone, that a good man handled things alone, that a good woman didn't burden others with her feelings. So when loneliness shows up now, later in life, it doesn't just feel uncomfortable. It feels like proof that you failed at the very toughness you spent a lifetime building. You think, I should be past this. I should be more self-sufficient than this. And so instead of naming the feeling, you push it down, keep busy, keep smiling at the pharmacy and the grocery store, and go home to a silence you never admit out loud. But think about it plainly for a moment. If a smoke alarm goes off in your house, you don't scold yourself for the alarm being loud. You don't decide there's something wrong with you because it went off. You check for the fire. Loneliness works the same way. It isn't the enemy. It's the alarm. It's telling you something true and important, that a basic human need isn't being met right now, and the appropriate response was never shame. It was attention. It was permission to take the feeling seriously instead of hiding it from yourself. There's something almost merciful in that reframe if you let it in. You are not broken for feeling this. You are not failing some late life exam in independence. You are a person whose nervous system is doing precisely what it evolved to do across tens of thousands of years, in a body that still remembers what it means to need a tribe. That's not weakness. That's your wiring. And here's something worth noticing, if you're honest with yourself. The people you've probably admired most across your life, the ones who seemed steady and wise and unbothered by the years, many of them weren't people who never felt lonely. They were people who stopped treating the feeling as a secret to be hidden. They let themselves notice it, name it, even mention it out loud to someone they trusted, instead of performing a kind of contentment they didn't actually feel. That honesty didn't make them weaker in anyone's eyes. If anything, it's usually what made people trust them more, because there's a quiet relief in being around someone who doesn't pretend. That's not failure. That's your nervous system doing exactly what it was built to do. And once you can see it that way, not as a personal flaw but as an old, honest signal, something loosens. You stop spending energy being ashamed of the ache, and you finally have energy left over to actually listen to it. That's where real change starts. Not in forcing yourself to feel differently, but in finally believing you were allowed to feel this in the first place. The world doesn't always make that easy, though, because sometimes it isn't just your own shame keeping you quiet. It's the sense that the world itself has simply gotten quieter around you. Reason number 2. The world grows quieter around you, not because you stopped matching. Think about your phone. Not the apps on it, the calls. Compare who used to call you 15 years ago to who calls you now. Chances are the list got shorter, not because you changed, but because the people on it did. Some passed away, some moved, some got swallowed up by their own busy, complicated lives, and somewhere in there, without any single dramatic moment, your circle simply thinned. It's tempting to read that thinning as a verdict on you, as if the silence on the phone were a message. You matter less now. But that conclusion, understandable as it is, isn't actually true, and it's worth taking apart carefully, because so many people carry it as fact for years without ever questioning it. Here's what's really happening. In your 20s, 30s, and 40s, your social circle was largely built by structure. A job that put you in a building with the same people every day, children who connected you to other parents at school pickup, a neighborhood full of families in the same busy season of life. Structure did a lot of the work of keeping in touch for you. You didn't have to plan friendship. It happened around you, built into the architecture of your days. Retirement removes that structure. So does an empty nest. So, painfully, does the death of a spouse who was often the true social glue, the one who remembered birthdays, planned the dinners, kept the group chat alive. When those scaffolds fall away, the contact naturally drops, not because your worth dropped, but because the machinery that used to manufacture closeness for you simply isn't running anymore. Nobody sent out a notice that your value had changed. The infrastructure just changed, and the phone got quieter as a side effect. There's also something harder to admit, and it deserves saying honestly. At a certain age, the world genuinely does lose people. Friends pass away. Siblings pass away. That is real, and it is not a reflection on you at all. It is simply what it means to have lived long enough to outlast some of the people you loved. Grieving that loss is appropriate. Interpreting it as personal rejection is not, and yet the mind, in its search for explanations, often reaches for the second one, because blame feels more controllable than grief does. There's a particular kind of pain in this that's worth naming directly, because it's rarely spoken about honestly. Watching your social world shrink can feel, at times, like grieving a version of yourself. The busy one, the needed one, the person whose calendar used to be full. That grief is legitimate. It deserves acknowledgement rather than dismissal. But it's a grief for a season of life, not a verdict on your worth within it. Seasons change for everyone who lives long enough to see them change. The people who seem to weather this stage most gracefully aren't the ones who somehow kept their circle exactly as full as it once was. Almost no one manages that. They're the ones who stopped mistaking the shrinking circle for a shrinking self. That's not a decline in your value. That's a decline in your infrastructure. Once you can separate those two things, your worth, and the machinery that used to display it to you daily, the quiet stops feeling like a verdict. It starts feeling like what it actually is. A change in circumstance, not a change in character. You are the same person who was worth calling 20 years ago. The phone just isn't set up the way it used to be, and that is something you can slowly rebuild on purpose, rather than something you have to silently accept as proof of your own fading importance. But even once you make peace with why the world got quieter, there's still the question of what to do with the silence itself, because not all silence is the same, and this next distinction matters more than almost anything else we'll talk about today. Reason number 3. Silence in a house doesn't mean silence in a life. Have you ever sat in your kitchen in the late afternoon, the light doing that particular gold thing it does before evening, nothing on the stove, no one due to call, and felt two completely different things depending on the day? Some afternoons, that stillness feels like peace. Other afternoons, the exact same stillness feels like a weight pressing on your chest. Same room, Same silence. Completely different experience. That difference has a name, and understanding it changes everything about how you relate to being alone. Solitude and loneliness are not the same thing, even though they can look identical from the outside. One person sitting quietly in a room. Solitude is chosen stillness, and it tends to feel spacious, even restorative. Loneliness is a felt absence, an ache for connection that isn't there, and it tends to feel like something is missing, like a held breath that won't release. The room doesn't determine which one you're in. Your relationship to yourself does. This matters enormously because a lot of people who are actually struggling with loneliness have been given the wrong prescription for it. More activity, more noise, more distraction, as if the goal were simply to never be alone with your own thoughts again. But that approach often backfires because it treats the symptom instead of the cause. You can fill every hour of your day with television, errands, and background noise, and still feel that hollow ache underneath it all, because the noise never actually addressed the need for real connection. It only postponed the moment you'd have to feel it. There's a reason this distinction gets overlooked so often. From the outside, a person sitting quietly by themselves looks the same whether they're at peace or aching. Family members, well-meaning as they are, sometimes glance at a parent or grandparent sitting alone and assume the worst, rushing in with concerned phone calls or insistence on filling every free hour with visits and activities, when what that person may have actually needed in that particular moment was simply to be left undisturbed with their own thoughts. Learning to tell the difference in yourself first is what makes it possible to eventually explain it to others too. The deeper work, the work wise elders eventually arrive at, is learning to build a genuine relationship with your own company, so that solitude becomes a resource instead of a threat. This isn't about pretending you don't need people, you do, and we're going to talk about that honestly throughout this video. It's about making sure that when you are alone, which at this stage of life you likely will be more often than before, it doesn't automatically collapse into loneliness. That takes practice. It might mean learning to sit with a cup of tea and your own thoughts without immediately reaching for the television to drown them out. It might mean writing a little or praying, or simply looking out the window and letting your mind wander somewhere without judging where it lands. Slowly, that kind of practiced solitude starts to feel less like abandonment and more like companionship with yourself. A relationship that, unlike so many others, can never be taken from you by distance or death. This is, in many ways, a skill you were never formally taught the way you were taught to drive or cook or manage money. Nobody sat you down decades ago and said, "Here's how you keep yourself company without it curdling into loneliness." Most people stumble into it by necessity, usually later in life, often during a season that forces the issue. A long illness, an empty house, a winter with fewer visitors than usual. And like any skill learned under pressure, it feels clumsy and unwelcome at first. But it does get easier. The tea gets a little warmer. The window gets a little more interesting. The thoughts that used to feel frightening to sit with start to feel, instead, like old familiar company of their own. That's not emptiness. That's the beginning of a different kind of company. None of this erases the real need for other people. Nothing could and nothing should. But learning to make peace with your own presence means the silence in your house stops being the enemy. Some of it becomes yours again, chosen rather than merely endured, and that shift alone can soften an ache that activity never quite reaches. Still, there's a particular kind of quiet that isn't about solitude at all. A quiet that comes specifically from loss, and it deserves its own honest conversation, because so many people mistake it for something else entirely. Reason number 4. Grief and loneliness live in the same room. If you've lost a spouse, a partner, a lifelong friend, you already know this next part in your body, even if no one ever said it to you directly. There's a particular hour, maybe it's when you'd normally be having coffee together or turning off the lights or telling them about your day, when the loneliness doesn't feel general. Feels aimed. It has their name on it. A lot of people who are grieving describe their pain using the word lonely, and then feel confused, even a little guilty, because it doesn't seem to match what they expected grief to feel like. They braced for sadness, for tears, maybe for anger. What surprises them is how much of it simply feels like being left in a very quiet room that used to have someone else's voice in it. Here's the truth worth sitting with. That confusion happens because grief and loneliness aren't separate experiences after a major loss. They're deeply tangled together, often indistinguishable in the moment. You're not just missing an activity partner or a conversation partner. This is why practical fixes so often fall short for people in fresh grief. Someone means well and says, "You should get out more, join a group, meet new people." And it isn't wrong, exactly, but it can feel almost insulting in the moment, because new people, however kind, cannot immediately replace 40, 50, 60 years of shared history. You're not just lonely for company. You're lonely for a particular person, and no amount of new company erases that specific absence. Grief has its own timeline, one that doesn't answer to anyone else's schedule, and loneliness that grows out of grief deserves to be treated with more patience than the ordinary advice usually allows. What tends to help over time isn't rushing to fill the space that person left. It's allowing that space to exist honestly while slowly, gently adding new sources of connection alongside it, rather than instead of it. Grief loneliness softens not because you replace what you lost, but because you gradually build enough new life around the edges of that loss that it stops being the only thing in the room. It's worth saying, too, that this kind of loneliness doesn't move in a straight line. You might feel it fade for weeks, even months, and then be caught completely off guard by it again. A certain song on the radio, the smell of a particular meal, the specific slant of afternoon light through a window you used to sit by together. That return isn't a setback. It isn't proof that you haven't healed properly, or that you're doing grief wrong. It's simply what love looks like when the person it was aimed at is no longer here to receive it directly. The feeling doesn't disappear just because the person did. It has to find new places to live, slowly, over time, and that process rarely follows a tidy schedule. That's not you failing to move on. That's love, still looking for somewhere to go. If you are in that specific ache right now, missing someone whose voice you can still hear in your head, please know that what you're feeling has a name, and it is not a defect in your grieving. It's love with nowhere left to land, and it deserves gentleness, not a deadline. Now, if grief is one kind of loneliness, there's another kind that's more subtle, one that has less to do with loss and more to do with how you've been thinking about the people still in your life. And it might be the most quietly transformative shift on this entire list. Reason number 5. You don't need many people. You need real ones. Think back, for a moment, to a birthday party or a family gathering from years ago. The kind with a full room, cousins and neighbors and coworkers all mixing together, laughter overlapping, more names than you could keep track of. Now think about the last time you felt truly, deeply understood by someone. Were those the same moment? For most people, honestly, they weren't. There's a quiet myth many people carry into their later years, that loneliness is essentially a math problem, solved by increasing the number of people around you. More visitors, more phone calls, more names on the guest list. But if that were really true, plenty of people surrounded by large families would never feel lonely at all, and yet many of them do deeply even in a full house, which tells us the equation was wrong from the start. What actually protects against loneliness isn't quantity of contact. It's quality of connection, specifically the sense of being truly known by at least one or two people, the sense that someone out there could describe not just what you do, but who you actually are underneath it. One real friend who calls you on your terrible days, who remembers the small details of your life without being reminded, who you don't have to perform for. That one relationship does more for your well-being than a dozen polite, surface-level acquaintances ever could. This isn't a consolation prize for people with smaller social circles. It's simply how human connection actually works at any age, but especially in these later years, when energy for maintaining wide, shallow networks naturally decreases. This is actually good news, even though it doesn't always feel like it at first. It means you don't need to force yourself into busy social calendars packed with people who leave you feeling more depleted than connected, just to prove to yourself that you're not lonely. It means the goal was never volume. Wise elders often describe a real shift here. Somewhere in their 70s or 80s, they stop chasing a wide circle and start deliberately protecting a small one. A weekly call with one daughter. A standing coffee with one old friend from church. A neighbor who checks in without being asked. These modest, consistent connections, repeated over time, build a kind of quiet security that 100 casual acquaintances never could. Think, for a moment, about the relationships in your life that actually restore you after you spend time in them, versus the ones that leave you a little more tired than before, even when they're pleasant enough on the surface. Most people, if they're honest, can name the difference immediately. The restoring ones usually aren't the largest or the most impressive. They're the ones where you don't have to explain yourself, where a long silence on the phone doesn't feel awkward, where you can say something ordinary or even a little sad and know it will be received gently rather than judged. Protecting those particular relationships, even just one or two of them, often does more for your sense of being loved than an entire address book of people who greet you kindly but don't actually know your life. That's not loneliness because your circle is small. That's the difference between being surrounded and being known. If you're feeling the ache of loneliness right now, it's worth asking yourself honestly, not, how do I meet more people? But, who, out of everyone in my life right now, actually knows me? And if the answer is only one or two people, that isn't a failure. That might be exactly enough if you tend to it with care. There's one more trap worth naming here, though, because it doesn't come from other people at all. It comes from inside your own memory, and it can be one of the most quietly cruel forms loneliness takes. Reason number 6. Loneliness gets louder when you compare your today to someone else's yesterday. Have you ever scrolled through old photographs? The ones from a reunion, a wedding, a Christmas 20 years back. Full of people, full of noise, full of a life that felt so undeniably crowded and alive? And then looked up from the photo album into your quiet living room right now, and felt the contrast land like a small blow to the chest? That particular ache deserves a closer look, because it isn't really loneliness in its purest form. It's something slightly different and slightly more treacherous, comparison loneliness, the pain of measuring your current, quieter life against a louder version of your own past, or worse, against someone else's carefully curated present. Here's what makes this trap so effective. Memory has a strange habit of smoothing things over. The photograph doesn't show the arguments that happened at that reunion, or the years you spent exhausted from raising small children, or the parts of that fuller life that were actually stressful, chaotic, or lonely in their own different way. What survives in memory is often the warmest, most golden version of events, stripped of their complications. So when you compare your real, textured present against that polished, edited past, you're not comparing two honest things. You're comparing your actual life to a highlight reel, and the highlight reel will always win because it was never fair in the first place. Social media makes this worse for people who use it in a slightly different but related way. You see other families' vacation photos, other grandparents' visits, other people's seemingly full calendars, and you assume that behind every one of those photos is a life free of the quiet you're sitting in right now. But you're only seeing the moment someone chose to share, not the ordinary Tuesday evenings that came before and after it, which likely looked far more like your own than you'd guess. This kind of comparison doesn't just make you feel lonely. It makes you feel like your loneliness is uniquely yours, uniquely deserved, uniquely evidence that something went wrong in how your life unfolded compared to everyone else's. And that layer, the sense of being singled out, is often more painful than the loneliness itself. That's not the truth about your life. That's an unfair fight between your real present and someone's edited past. There's also a quieter version of this comparison trap that doesn't involve photographs or social media at all. It's the version that happens purely in your own head, late at night, when you measure your current quiet life against some imagined version of how things were supposed to turn out by now. Maybe you pictured more grandchildren visiting, a fuller holiday table, a retirement that looked different than the one you actually got. That imagined life was never real to begin with, which makes it an especially unfair standard to hold your actual life against. You're not falling short of a life you once had. You're being asked, unfairly, to measure yourself against a life that never existed anywhere except in your own expectations. The way out of this particular trap isn't to stop remembering the good years, or to pretend the photographs don't matter. It's to stop treating them as a scoreboard. Your loudest, fullest years and your quietest years are both simply chapters, not a verdict on which version of your life was more worthy. Once you can look at that old photograph and feel warmth instead of grief for a version of life that was never going to last forever anyway, the comparison loses its grip, and what's left is simply gratitude for having had it at all. Now, before we go further, I want to pause and speak directly to whoever is watching this right now, sitting somewhere quiet, maybe with the volume turned up because the house is too still otherwise. If any part of what we've covered so far has felt uncomfortably familiar, that's not an accident, and it's not a coincidence either. It means some part of you has been carrying this honestly, maybe for longer than anyone around you realizes. I want you to know that noticing it right now, in this moment, is already the beginning of something loosening. Stay with me a little longer because what comes next might be the most important part. Reason number 7. The loneliest people are often the ones who never learn to ask. Picture this. Your neighbor's driveway needs shoveling, or your porch light burned out weeks ago and you still haven't asked your son to come replace it, even though he's offered a dozen times. Why does it feel so much harder to say, "I need you to come over," than to simply endure the inconvenience alone? For many people your age, asking for help, especially asking for company, which can feel even more exposed than asking for a favor, runs directly against a lifetime of conditioning. You were likely raised in a generation that prized self-reliance almost as a moral virtue. Independence wasn't just practical. It was proof of good character. Needing others, especially emotionally, could feel like admitting weakness in a way that needing a plumber never did. But here is the quiet cruelty of that conditioning. The very trait that helped you survive difficult decades. Raising families through hardship, working through recessions, holding households together without complaint, becomes later in life one of the biggest obstacles to receiving the connection you actually need. You spent so long being the strong one, the one others leaned on, that the muscle for leaning on someone else atrophied from disuse. So now, when loneliness sets in, your instinct isn't to reach out. It's to endure quietly, the same way you always have, because that's the only skill this particular part of your life ever trained you in. It also helps to notice how differently this generation treats asking for practical help versus asking for emotional company, even though both come from the same underlying vulnerability. Calling a son to fix a leaky faucet feels acceptable, almost expected. Calling that same son to say, "I just wanted to hear your voice today," can feel, to many people, far more exposing, as if emotional need were somehow less legitimate than a practical one. But there's no real difference between them. Both are simply forms of the same honest request. Come closer, I need you. One just wears a tool belt, and the other doesn't. The people around you, meanwhile, are often not withholding contact out of neglect. They're waiting for a signal because they genuinely don't know you need them. You've spent decades appearing fine, and fine people don't usually get checked on as often as they should. Your children, your neighbors, your old friends. Many of them would show up in a heartbeat if they knew you wanted them to. But independence has a strange side effect. It can make you nearly invisible to the very people who would gladly close the distance, simply because you never gave them the invitation. Asking isn't weakness. It's actually one of the most vulnerable, and therefore one of the most courageous, things a person can do, especially after a lifetime of being told the opposite. A short phone call, "I'd love it if you visited this weekend," or an honest word to a friend, "I've been feeling pretty alone lately," is not a burden placed on someone else's shoulders. For most people who love you, it's a gift. It tells them exactly how to be there for you instead of leaving them guessing from a distance, unsure whether reaching out would even be welcome. Consider, too, how you feel on the rare occasions when someone else asks you for help, or admits they've been lonely, or tells you plainly that they miss you. Does it make you think less of them? Almost certainly not. If anything, it probably draws you closer, makes you want to show up for them even more than before. That's worth remembering the next time you hesitate to make the same kind of ask yourself. The people who love you are very unlikely to judge you by a standard you would never apply to them. That's not dependency. That's finally letting the people who love you do what they've wanted to do all along. If there's one thing wise elders eventually learn, often later than they wish they had, it's this. The ask itself is rarely as heavy as it feels beforehand. And once it's out of your mouth, once someone says yes, and they usually do, you often wonder why you carried the silence alone for as long as you did. There's another layer to loneliness that deserves honesty too, because it isn't only something you feel in your thoughts. It shows up somewhere else entirely, somewhere people rarely think to look. Reason number 8. Loneliness has a body, not just a mind. Have you noticed that on your loneliest days your body seems to feel it too? A heaviness in your limbs, a tiredness that sleep doesn't quite fix, maybe even your appetite shifting in one direction or the other. It's not your imagination, and it's not a sign that something separate and alarming is happening. It's simply a reminder of how deeply connected your emotional life and your physical life really are. We tend to think of loneliness as something that lives entirely in the mind. A mood, a feeling, something that stays contained in your thoughts while your body carries on unaffected. But that separation was never quite accurate. Emotional states ripple outward into the body constantly. Stress tightens your shoulders. Grief sits in your chest. And prolonged loneliness, in a similar way, tends to show up as fatigue, restlessness, changes in sleep, a general sense of low energy that can be hard to pin to any single cause. It isn't that loneliness is causing a medical problem. It's simply that your body and your emotional life were never really two separate systems in the first place. They speak to each other constantly, in both directions. This matters because it means the fix isn't always going to be found by treating the body alone, and it also isn't going to be found by treating the mind alone, as if the feeling could be reasoned away in isolation. The two need to be addressed together. A short walk outside, even a slow one, does something for loneliness that willpower alone cannot. Moving your body changes what's happening in your mind, gently, without requiring you to think your way out of the feeling first. Sunlight on your face, the physical sensation of fresh air, even the simple rhythm of footsteps, all of it speaks to the nervous system in a language older than conscious thought. There's also something worth naming honestly here. If you've been feeling unusually low for an extended stretch of time, not just an occasional quiet afternoon, but a persistent heaviness that doesn't lift, that's worth mentioning to someone who can actually help, whether that's a doctor, a counselor, or someone at your place of worship you trust. There is no shame in that conversation. Taking your own well-being seriously enough to ask for support is not weakness dressed up as vulnerability. It's simply wisdom, and it's available to you. This is also why so many small, almost old-fashioned rituals matter more than they seem to on the surface. A regular meal eaten at the table rather than standing at the counter, a short walk at the same time each day, even simply getting dressed in the morning rather than staying in pajamas until noon. None of these things cure loneliness in some dramatic way, but they signal something quiet and important to your nervous system, that you are still worth caring for, still worth the small daily effort of tending to. Over time, that signal adds up the same way neglecting it day after day adds up in the opposite direction. That's not just sadness in your head. That's your whole self, quietly asking to be looked after. None of this means every ache in your body is loneliness in disguise, of course. But it does mean that when you're caring for your emotional life, you're also caring for your physical one, and the two were never as separate as we sometimes pretend. Which brings us to something almost every wise elder eventually discovers, often only after years of trying to fight loneliness head-on and finding that the fighting itself never quite worked. Reason number 9. Wise elders don't fix loneliness. They learn to befriend it. There's a version of you, maybe from 10 or 20 years ago, that believed loneliness was a problem to be solved once and permanently. Get the right friends, the right routine, the right amount of family contact, and the ache would simply disappear for good, like a debt finally paid off. Most people who reach real age carry that belief for a long time, and most eventually discover, gently or painfully, that it isn't quite true. Loneliness, it turns out, isn't a problem with a permanent solution. It's closer to weather. It comes, it passes, it returns sometimes without much warning, shaped by seasons, by anniversaries, by an empty afternoon that catches you off guard even in an otherwise full life. Wise elders, the ones who seem to carry a kind of settled peace even in their quieter years, don't tend to describe having defeated loneliness once and for all. What they describe instead is something closer to a truce, an honest, ongoing relationship with the feeling, rather than a war against it. There's a well-known line, often attributed to the poet Rilke, that captures this shift better than almost anything else. He wrote that loneliness is not something to be reasoned away, but something to be taken as a companion on the journey, since it will keep returning throughout a life, whether invited or not. Read that again slowly if you need to. He isn't saying loneliness is pleasant. He's saying that fighting it as an enemy for an entire lifetime is a losing battle, but befriending it, expecting it, recognizing it, no longer being ambushed by its return, changes your entire relationship to it. What does befriending it actually look like, practically? It means that when loneliness shows up on a Sunday evening or the anniversary of a loss, you no longer treat its arrival as evidence that your life has failed. You recognize it almost the way you'd recognize an old, familiar visitor, not one you invited but not a stranger either. You let it sit with you for a while, without panicking, without immediately scrambling to fill every silence with noise. And then, often, it passes on its own, the way weather does, leaving you a little more at peace than if you'd spent the whole time fighting it. This is not resignation. It's not giving up on connection, and it's not an excuse to stop reaching out to people, which we've talked about honestly throughout this entire video. It's simply releasing the exhausting expectation that a full life must be a life entirely free of this particular ache. Even people surrounded by deep love, good marriages, close families, devoted friends, still feel lonely sometimes. That isn't failure. That's simply what it means to be a feeling, thinking person moving through a long life. That's not surrender. That's the wisdom of finally stopping the fight you were never meant to win completely. This shift tends to arrive quietly, without any single dramatic turning point. It might show up as the moment you catch yourself, mid-lonely evening, thinking, there you are again, instead of panicking. It might show up as no longer needing to explain a quiet Sunday to yourself as evidence of a wasted life. Whatever form it takes, it tends to bring with it a kind of relief that's hard to describe to someone who hasn't reached it yet. Not the relief of the ache disappearing, but the relief of no longer needing it to. If there is a single truth wise elders carry that younger people haven't learned yet, it might be this one. Peace was never going to come from eliminating loneliness entirely. It comes from no longer being afraid of it when it visits. Which brings us, gently, back to where we began. Remember that quiet after the door closed, the one that settled into the chairs and the hallway after your family left? Here's what's true about that moment, now that we've walked through all of this together. That quiet was never proof that you'd been forgotten, or that your life had grown small, or that something in you had failed to keep people close. It was your old, honest wiring doing exactly what it was built to do. It was grief, maybe still looking for somewhere to land. It was, perhaps, an invitation to finally ask for what you've quietly needed all along. And it was also, if you let it be, simply weather, something that would pass the way it always eventually does, leaving you a little wiser than before it arrived. You are not the only one sitting in a quiet room tonight. Somewhere out there, someone else your age is standing in their own entryway, feeling the exact same thing you felt, wondering the exact same thing, whether they still matter to anyone at all. You do. Not because a video told you so, but because the ache itself is proof that you were built, deeply and permanently, for connection, and that need never expires no matter how many years pass or how many rooms grow quiet around you. Maybe nothing about your circumstances will look different tomorrow morning. The house might still be quiet. The phone might not ring any more often than it did yesterday. But something in how you carry that quiet can be different now if you let it. You can carry it with shame the way you might have before today, treating it as proof of something gone wrong. Or you can carry it the way a wise elder eventually learns to, as an old, honest signal, as grief still finding its way, as an invitation you finally have permission to accept. The circumstances may be the same. What you make of them doesn't have to be. If this found you at the right moment, if some part of this felt like it was speaking directly to you, I'd love for you to stay a little longer with us here. Subscribe if you'd like more honest conversations like this one. Not the kind that rush past what's real, but the kind that sit with you in it. And if you know someone else who might need to hear this today, a friend, a parent, someone you haven't called in a while, maybe this is the moment to reach out. Not because you have to, just because now you finally know you're allowed to. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.